Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you're at. Emily, thanks for joining me. So today we're going to be talking about Saudi Arabia, U.S. I know, Emily, that's been something that you've been asked a number of questions on over the last few days, few weeks about, I guess the poor relationship following the OPEC meeting last week. Just can you just give your broad overview of what you think the U.S. Saudi relationship is right now?
Yeah, so the US Saudi relationship is certainly in a tense moment right now. We have really it's been focused a lot on sort of the oil dynamics, the energy dynamics between the two governments over this last year, given the high gasoline prices in the United States and the political impact that that has on President Biden and the upcoming election. But the US Saudi relationship is, of course, so much more than that. There's a military component, security component, there's all sorts of ways in which these two governments are aligned in terms of what they want to see in the world. And then there are ways that they are not aligned. The Russia Ukraine crisis and the fact that Saudi Arabia hasn't been, of course, nearly as adamant in condemning the Russian action in Ukraine, um, compared to Western countries, including the United States, that's been a bit of a stressor. So there are several sort of places where the relationship is very tense, and I think that what we're arriving at is this reality that the U.S. Saudi relationship has many sort of multilateral points of connection and cooperation, but there are so many places in this relationship where both countries are working for their own interests. And we talk about this so often when we talk about geopolitics, countries working for their own interests. Um, but yeah, so I think I would say, just to simply answer your question, relations are very tense between the two governments. President Biden made a very prominent visit to Saudi Arabia in July of this year, and was very sort of clearly seeking
It didn't
cooperation with
work.
Saudi Arabia,
It didn't work, did it?
and it didn't work. So that's probably the most obvious point of tension that we could start with and start to break down. And I don't know. I mean, you want to break that down for us, like where we are with energy and
Yeah.
oil?
So we saw, of course, Biden going to Saudi Arabia. The intent there was for Saudi Arabia to organize a production increase. We actually did see that in the month of August. They agreed to a very small increase. So I think it was 100,000 barrels per day for OPEC at large. Not all that actually entered the market. And then very next month, Saudi Arabia rolled that back. And then last week, we then had OPEC Plus cutting production by a whopping 2 million barrels per day. For context, that's 2% of the global oil market. That's not a small amount. Now, the actual decline in production and exports will be lower, probably like half of that, if even that, because a lot of the countries in OPEC and OPEC Plus weren't producing where they could actually, at their quota levels. They just can't right now, to be honest. But it was a clear message by the Saudis. Yes, there are oil market reasons as to why they are doing that, recession concerns, all those kinds of things. But it was a very clear signal to the White House that the Saudis do not support what the White House is doing right now with respect to its sanction strategy against Russia. And what I mean by that is the G7's price cap on Russian oil. For the Saudis, that is a dangerous precedent. If you have Western governments being able to force upon, for political reasons, whether it be something that is may be, I guess, more morally valid, like the war in Ukraine, a price cap or a price ceiling on a major commodity, that's a very significant precedent that's going to be established. What's then to look down the road? Would these oil consuming countries try to do the same thing around Saudi Arabia's oil exports or somebody else's within OPEC? So that precedent is very dangerous, and I think they would probably view it as a very slippery slope, especially if you go back a few years ago. Let's assume that this price cap works. There's a question as to whether or not it'll be that effective. Let's assume that it does work, and it's proven that it can work. Go back a few years ago when President Trump was running for re-election and oil prices had gone up. What did he do to the Saudis? He threatened to pull military support. If President Trump or another person that has a very aggressive attitude towards the Saudis around oil prices wants to emulate that strategy for political reasons at home, what's to stop them from doing it? So I think it's
Right.
that dangerous precedent that's being started. And to be clear, it's not just about oil. We even heard like officials from Indonesia being concerned about this precedent, not because Indonesia is a major oil producer, they're a decent sized one, but because of, for example, Indonesian exports of nickel or other commodities that are going to become, crucial, especially for the energy transition. So that's where I'm thinking, like, on the backdrop, excuse me, of what the Saudis are trying to do here.
Yeah, and I think that makes sense. And earlier this week, the Saudi Minister of State for Foreign Affairs, Foreign Minister Adel Al Jubeir, said very clearly in an interview that in response to this question of did you do this to benefit Russia? And he said very clearly, no, we're doing this for the stability of the oil markets. And I think that kind of aligns with what you're saying in terms of Saudi Arabia wanting to ward off the possibility of the establishment of this kind of precedent that they're worried is going to create problems for them later on. And
But I mean, look about it. Look at it here in the U.S. though. Every single op-ed is basically every single op-ed. A lot of politicians they're coming out, they're tweeting, they're writing their reports or whatnot, and they're saying, regardless of the reason, the justification, it is siding with Russia. Um,
exactly.
and from the Biden government's perspective, it's also not what the U.S. wanted. The U.S. reportedly requested like a delay until after the election of that. And of course, given the relationship that the White House, the Biden administration has with the Saudis, it's not surprised why they wouldn't delay it. To be honest,
Right.
um,
So
but
it does become a slap in the face to the United
right.
States and what they were trying to do with Saudi Arabia's help or even without Saudi Arabia's help, but it just directly flies in the face of what the United States wanted to happen, especially at this critical moment.
Yeah, and what I thought was really interesting is the White House has put out a few statements, and then John Kirby, the spokesman for I believe, the National Security Council, he came out basically saying, in very heavy-handed words, that this is not what a U.S. partner should do. And we don't really normally see. Yes, we know the Saudi relationship with the U.S. It's never been bound by shared values. It's always been this kind of shared interests, I guess, like on oil market stability. And they disagree on a lot of things. And over the years, they disagree on things like the Iran nuclear deal. It's not new for them to disagree on things. But this public airment of the dirty baggage around it, that's pretty unique. We didn't even really see that to the same degree when Jamal Khashoggi was murdered. So it's at least not from the U.S. government officially. So I think that's unique. So we also saw, and I want to ask you this: President Biden saying on Monday that the U.S. would review its relationship with Saudi Arabia. What does that actually mean?
Yeah, I think what's interesting about that statement is uh, one, that it's not clear because the relationship has been changing for so many years. And what the United States wants in the Middle East region, of which Saudi Arabia is one of the prominent US partners, one of the most powerful countries. Um, it's not immediately clear what the United States is trying to achieve in the region. So I think there's a bit of a blurred bit of strategic intent that the United States hasn't been articulate about in terms of what it wants holistically out of partners in the region. There certainly are goals that have been delineated: counterterrorism and stability goals, countering Iran, um, the ensuring the stability of oil markets. There are aspects of that relationship that have been articulated, but there are other parts of it as well that are murkier and that are changing. Things like working with Middle Eastern partners to counter Russian influence, things like working with Middle Eastern partners to counter Chinese influence. And when you look at a country like Saudi Arabia, Saudi Arabia has been growing its relationship with China commercially, economically, just like all the other GCC states. I mean, I used to live in the UAE, and you would see Chinese companies everywhere. And every time I've gone back since, you see more Chinese companies and more of a footprint of just evidence of those really growing ties between China and some of the Arab Gulf states. And that is where I think it gets a little bit murky in terms of what the United States wants out of a partner like Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is not going to abide by trying to pressure and limit Chinese sort of influence in the Middle East region. And also, it's the same sort of open question with Russia. And that, I think, could create a problem for the United States moving forward.
And it already is creating a problem. That's kind of what we're seeing right now with in terms of the Ukraine war. And I know this is a trend that RANE has been writing on for a few years now about this kind of strategic divergence, I guess you could call it, between Saudi Arabia and the United States. You talked about the China relationship. China is a major client, at least for energy resources for Saudi Arabia.
Right.
China is not making the same moves around decarbonization commitments, so they're going to be burning oil for a very long time. Saudi Arabia is looking at ways to diversify its security partnership, especially as this Biden administration has, paused some weapon sales because of human rights concerns. China is not going to really do that. The U.S. also isn't always selling them what the Saudis want. China has been a long-standing relationship with actually, giving away or selling, I guess not giving away, ballistic missile technology to the Saudis that the U.S. isn't willing to sell. So I think those kinds of strategic divergences are going to continue to widen. And as the U.S., and if you look at the Biden administration's national security strategy, which was released this week, it clearly made an emphasis towards, peer competition with China is rising and considerably. That's going to become a point of contention between the two that we never really saw, at least during the second half of the Cold War,
Right.
because the Saudis were very clearly on the side of the United States. And also, to our viewers, if you have any questions, please send them in. We're definitely happy to include those.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's, I think we're in that trajectory long term.
Definitely. And then, and yes, you brought up an important point that we should be clear about. Um, when I say that the United States government is not totally clear about its strategic objectives in the MENA region, you mentioned the fact that sort of countering China is very clearly delineated in the United States national security strategy. That is absolutely the case. But how that works in places like the Middle East is not immediately clear for the reasons that both you and I have laid out and others.
And
Um,
the Middle East is just not the same priority it once was. Now the U.S. is the Middle East. It's not that the Middle East isn't important. It's that it's now a much bigger of a back seat to these other priorities compared to where it was during the height of the global war on terror.
Right. But the United States still needs the cooperation and collaboration with partners like Saudi Arabia to still ensure US interests there. There still is a massive US military footprint in, across the whole Middle East region, Saudi Arabia included, and the rest of the Arabian Peninsula and the GCC states. And we've talked a lot about how there is this shifting view towards Asia and trying to potentially pull some of those resources over to Asia to focus more energy on the issues that the US thinks are more strategically important. But they can't really do that if they don't have some of the cooperation of countries within the Middle East, at least some alignment with the United States enduring sort of security objectives in that region. Things like continuing to protect Israel and containing Iran and working against terrorist groups, etc. And certainly the United States and Saudi Arabia still very pragmatically and productively cooperate in these areas, but there are open questions toward the future. And again, earlier this week, you were mentioning there were a lot of things that happened just recently in this relationship, and we had the Senate Foreign Relations Committee chairman Robert Menendez say, "Hey, the U.S. should freeze all cooperation with Saudi Arabia, and we should." And a statement like that could it means that Menendez could use his position to try and block future arms sales to Saudi Arabia. And even though it's not likely that that we would see any new arms sales proposed before these upcoming midterm elections, it does open up this question about how intensifying congressional anger at Saudi Arabia
It's not even
could
congressional,
impact the
right?
relationship.
At this point, it is the White House, and I think where I kind of wanted to leave the last few minutes of this on is what we can expect from the U.S. And I'm thinking the White House and Congress, because Biden was very clear that he wants to work with Congress on various things. So it doesn't seem like the Biden administration is going to do any new arms sales besides something that is very mundane, maybe like a deployment of Patriots because the Houthis have done something, something like that. One of the things that got a lot of airwaves was when the Biden administration specifically said that they were going to work with Congress around issues pertaining to OPEC's ability to price things in the oil market. And that's immediately brought up speculation that maybe the White House will, at least to my knowledge, be the first one that would potentially support the so-called NOPEC legislation. So that legislation essentially would allow would essentially strip away the sovereign immunity for OPEC members so that they could then be sued for violating U.S. Antitrust law. And
Mhm.
there are companies like Saudi Aramco, all those companies that can. That would be a major deal in terms of a breakdown in U.S. Saudi relations and major dispute. I personally still think it's unlikely. I think that the U.S., as you mentioned, Emily, it still needs Saudi Arabia to help out against Iran. Also normalization with Israel, all these kinds of things. So I think that is probably not possible,
Mhm.
but what is possible, I guess.
I mean, I think certainly what is possible is a slowing down of major arms sales to Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia has been one of the biggest customers of US arms over the last many decades. And um, that is something where, one, it opens up the possibility of Saudi Arabia getting those arms from, if they can't get them from the United States, they're going to get them somewhere. And that creates potential problems for the United States if they're buying them from
Feedback
Russia
loop.
and China.
Feedback loop. We don't sell
Yeah,
them to you, so you go buy
exactly.
them from the Chinese. It reinforces the idea.
Exactly. But that doesn't mean that there won't be complications for future arms sales. And that would mean a big disruption to one of the strongest sort of components of this relationship so far, which is this really close integration between the U.S. military and sort of how the Saudi security forces and military are built. We've already seen over the last several years as the United States has been drawing back from some of its footprint in the Middle East in places like Yemen, a conflict that the United States does not want to be overtly involved in. We've seen the U.S. pull back from some of its direct support to Saudi Arabia. It used to provide refueling, and it really has pulled back in some of its direct military support. I think more and more the United States would be less of a direct option, sort of assisting Saudi Arabia in any of its sort of military activity. If this trajectory of worsening relations just continues to deepen and get worse, because it's going to be hard to maintain that really close security cooperation if the relationship is sort of in shambles. We're not quite there yet,
Yeah.
but I do think that that's a very likely potential outcome in the long term.
Yeah, the other two things that I was thinking about that could be affected. I know one thing that the White House was considering. I don't think they've made a final decision on it yet. Was pulling, I guess, diplomatic support for the FII. So that's the conference that the Saudis put on every October. This was supposed to be the big one. It's coming up in a couple of weeks. The big one that is like the post-pandemic one, I guess. That
Mhm.
is something. I mean, it's not going to have a huge impact, of course, but that's
'Cause
something that
companies will still want to,
yeah.
you know, but
And then I think the other thing that Saudi Arabia will just find increasingly as they partner with China, as they partner with Russia, is that there will be blowback from companies from a reputational standpoint. That
right.
companies will have to consider: do I want to, work with the Saudi government as they're doing these kinds of things? And the answer may be, in some cases, it's still profitable. They can, put it under the rug. But in some industries, the answer might be, they can't, or they're not, or they do, and then they have to face put into place risk mitigation strategies around that.
Yeah, and that's a really important point, and it dovetails with the existing human rights concerns that the US government has expressed, regarding Saudi Arabia and some of their domestic policies. Certainly the murder of Jamal Khashoggi was a huge, issue between them, but really has largely sort of, um, evaporated as, like, a major source of tension between the White House and Saudi Arabia, but we could see some of that tension build up again, if this sort of oil component of the relationship becomes really, really acrimonious. So I agree that that's a really important point to watch.
Yeah. With that, I think we've hit a lot of our high points. Emily, did you have anything else you wanted to hit on that we haven't touched on yet?
I don't. I think we hit on the high points, but if people have more questions, they can always write into us. So
Yeah. If you'd like to, learn more about what RANE can do and also some of the analysis that Emily and I put together, please visit our website at ranenetwork.com. That's RANE network.com. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Emily.
thank you.